The notification pinged on my phone at exactly 2:17 a.m. I wouldn't normally have been awake, but Mason's empty side of the bed had kept me tossing and turning for hours. He'd claimed another emergency meeting had come up, the third this week. Transfer complete, $27,500 to external account. I blinked at my screen, wondering if I was dreaming. That was nearly all of our savings, money we'd been putting aside for our long-planned trip to New Zealand, for the down payment on our forever home, for our future. I sat up, suddenly wide awake, and opened our joint banking app. There it was, the transaction glaring back at me. Our account balance, $412.37. Mason had never been tech-savvy. When we merged our finances after the wedding, I'd set up all the accounts, made sure the bills got paid, managed our investments. He'd joked that numbers made his head spin, that he was lucky to have married an accountant. What he didn't realize was that I'd kept every password, every security question, every digital key to our financial kingdom. My hands trembled as I opened my laptop and began digging. It didn't take long to find the trail. Text messages synced. To our cloud account, hotel receipts emailed to an address he thought I didn't know about. And finally, photos. Mason and a woman I recognized as his new assistant, Vanessa, looking very much not like colleagues. The most recent transaction had gone to an account under her name. I should have been devastated. Instead, a strange calm washed over me as I started taking screenshots, downloading statements, gathering digital evidence. By sunrise, I'd contacted a lawyer, frozen our remaining assets, and documented everything. But before confronting Mason, I decided to learn more. Who was this Vanessa? Really? How long had this been going on? Information is power, and I needed all the power I could gather. Vanessa Miller, 29, executive assistant at Mason's company for 8 months. Her LinkedIn profile was impeccable, but her social media told a different story. Photos at exclusive restaurants, a new watch that cost more than she should earn in 2 months, and several cryptic captions about new beginnings and taking chances. I scrolled back further in our bank statements. It hadn't started with this massive transfer. There were smaller withdrawals, $500 here, $1,000 there, building up over the past 6 months. Money I'd assumed was going toward business expenses, or the surprise he claimed he was planning for our anniversary. The sun was fully up when I finally closed my laptop. My eyes burned from staring at screens all night, but my mind was crystal clear. This wasn't just about the money or even the betrayal. It was about the utter disrespect, the assumption that I wouldn't notice, wouldn't fight back. Mason had underestimated me. Badly. I showered, dressed in my most confidence-boosting outfit, a tailored charcoal pantsuit I reserved for my biggest client presentations, and made coffee. Then I called my office and told them I'd be taking a personal day, possibly several. "Everything okay, Lisa?" my assistant asked, concern evident in her voice. "Not yet," I replied, "but it will be." My next call was to Diane, my best friend, since college, and conveniently, a divorce attorney specializing in high-conflict cases. "He did what?" Her voice rose an octave when I explained the situation. "I need to know my options, Di. All of them. And I need to move quickly before he realizes I'm onto him. Come to my office, now, and bring every financial document you can get your hands on." 2 hours later, I sat across from Diane in her downtown office, surrounded by printouts of bank statements, investment accounts, property deeds, and insurance policies. "This is actually perfect," Diane said, examining a particularly damning email exchange between Mason and Vanessa. "Financial infidelity coupled with actual infidelity. The courts will crucify him. I don't want to just win, Di. I want him to understand exactly how badly he miscalculated." She leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Then let's talk strategy." The plan we devised was elegant in its simplicity. I wouldn't confront Mason immediately. Instead, I'd gather more evidence, secure our remaining assets, and prepare for the moment when I could reveal what I knew with maximum impact. That evening, when Mason finally came home shortly after 9, I greeted him with a warm smile and a glass of his favorite whiskey. He looked momentarily startled. I hadn't been this welcoming in weeks. "Rough day?" I asked, playing the role of concerned wife as he loosened his tie. "Budget meetings," he sighed, accepting the drink. "Soul-crushing boredom wrapped in spreadsheets." The lie rolled off his tongue so effortlessly that I almost admired his performance. Almost. "Well, I'm glad you're home." I kissed his cheek, breathing in the unfamiliar perfume clinging to his collar, not mine. "I've got a surprise for you." His eyes widened slightly. "Oh?" "Two. I've been doing some financial planning," I said, keeping my voice light. "Looking at our retirement options, investment strategies. I thought maybe this weekend we could sit down and go through everything together." I watched the color drain slightly from his face, replaced by a forced smile. "That sounds thorough, but I might have to work this weekend. Big project deadline." "Of course," I nodded understandingly. "Your work is important. We can do it another time." As he headed for the shower, I sent a quick text to Diane. "He took the bait. He's getting nervous." She replied immediately. "Perfect. Keep him guessing." That night, lying beside Mason in our bed, listening to his pretend sleep breathing, I felt strangely powerful. He had no idea what was coming. No idea that in my seeming ignorance lay my greatest strength. No idea that with every passing minute, I was one step closer to dismantling the life he thought he was building with Vanessa. I closed my eyes, finally able to sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. Tomorrow would bring a new phase of my plan, and I needed to be rested for what lay ahead. Mason would soon learn that betraying an accountant with access to all his financial secrets was the worst mistake he'd ever made. Morning arrived with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. While Mason was in the shower, I quickly checked our accounts. No new transactions. He was being cautious now, probably planning his next move. I made breakfast, his favorite, Belgian waffles with fresh berries, and set the table with our wedding china. A performance of normalcy while I plotted his downfall. "This looks amazing," Mason said, eyeing the spread. He seemed relieved by my apparent good mood, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I thought we could use a nice breakfast. We've both been so busy lately." I poured him coffee, playing the devoted wife one last time. "Lisa, about this weekend." "Don't worry about it," I interrupted smoothly. "Actually, I've decided to visit my sister. It's been ages since I've seen her and the kids." Relief washed over his face. "That's a great idea. You deserve a break." "I bet you'd think so," I thought, but smiled and nodded. My visit to my sister was actually a meeting with a forensic accountant Diane had recommended. I needed to know if there were other accounts, other secrets I hadn't uncovered yet. "Mrs. Reynolds, this is fascinating work," said Martin Chen, poring over the documents I'd brought. "Your husband created a separate LLC 6 months ago. He's been funneling money through it." "How much?" My voice remained steady. "Based on these transfers, approximately $63,000. The room seemed to tilt slightly. That was substantially more than I'd discovered. Money that could have been our future, our security. "Can we trace where it went?" Martin nodded. "Most of it appears to have been transferred to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The account holder is listed as VM Enterprises. Vanessa Miller. Not very creative with the naming, these two." "And now for the good news," Martin continued. "He made several critical mistakes. First, he used your joint funds to establish the LLC, creating a clear paper trail. Second, he used your home address as the business address, which makes it marital property. Third, he apparently doesn't understand tax law. He set himself up for significant penalties. I felt a grim satisfaction. Mason's financial carelessness was becoming my greatest asset. Armed with this new information, I updated Diane. She was practically gleeful. "Lisa, this isn't just a divorce case anymore. This is potential fraud, tax evasion, and misappropriation of marital assets. We have enough to go nuclear." "Not yet," I cautioned. "I need to know everything before I make my move." That evening, I called Mason to tell him I'd be staying with my sister through the weekend. He sounded distracted, eager to end the call. In the background, I heard a woman's laughter. "Have fun with your sister," he said. "Don't worry about rushing back." "Oh, I won't," I promised, and meant it in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. Back in my hotel room, I opened my laptop and accessed the home security system, another account Mason didn't know I controlled. Our house was equipped with cameras at every entrance, originally installed after a neighborhood break-in. Now they would serve a different purpose. Sure enough, less than an hour after our call, Mason arrived home with Vanessa. They didn't even make it upstairs before clothes started coming off, their betrayal now documented in high-definition video. I watched just long enough to confirm what I already knew, then closed the laptop. Some wounds didn't need salt rubbed in them. Besides, I had something better to focus on. Revenge served cold, calculated, and by the book. 3. The next morning, I met with Diane at a coffee shop 3 towns over, far from any prying eyes that might know us. I handed her a flash drive containing selected clips from the security footage. "This feels surreal," I admitted, stirring my latte absently. 8 years of marriage, and it turns out I never really knew him at all. Diane squeezed my hand. "Don't go down that road, Lisa. This isn't about you failing to see something. This is about Mason being a lying, cheating embezzler." She was right, of course. But knowing that intellectually didn't stop the ache in my chest, the questions that kept me awake at night. Had there been signs I missed? Was there a moment when I could have changed the course of events? "I've contacted the bank's fraud department," I said, pushing those thoughts aside. "They've opened an investigation based on the evidence of unauthorized transfers." "Good. And I've prepared preliminary divorce papers. We can file Monday morning if you're ready." I nodded. "I'm ready." But there was one more thing I needed to do before bringing my world crashing down around Mason's ears. I needed to understand my enemy. Vanessa Miller remained something of a cipher. Young, ambitious, clearly willing to sleep her way into money. But there had to be more to the story. Why Mason? Why now? Using the digital trail of their communications, I had pieced together that they'd met at a company retreat last fall. Their affair had begun almost immediately after, with Mason creating the LLC within weeks. It wasn't just a fling. This was calculated, planned. I decided to take a risk. Using a burner phone purchased with cash, I sent a text to Vanessa's personal number. "I know about the Cayman account. We need to talk about Mason." 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a response. "Who is this?" "Someone with mutual interests. Plaza Hotel Bar, 7 p.m. tonight. Come alone." It was dangerous, potentially ruining the element of surprise, but I needed to see her face to face, to understand what I was dealing with. I arrived early, choosing a corner table with a clear view of the entrance. I'd dressed differently than my usual style. Hair pulled back severely, glasses I rarely wore, a sleek black dress that wasn't part of my regular wardrobe. I doubted Vanessa would recognize me from the few company photos where I'd appeared. She arrived precisely at 7, looking nervous but determined. She was beautiful in that obvious way that photographs couldn't quite capture. All glossy dark hair and perfect makeup, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Our stolen money at work. She scanned the bar, and I raised my hand slightly. When she approached, I gestured to the seat across from me. "Thanks for coming," I said calmly. "Who are you?" Her voice had an edge of fear beneath the bravado. Just someone who knows what Mason is really up to. I sipped my wine. Did you know there's another woman in Boston? And one in Chicago? You're not the first associate he's promised a new life to. It was a complete bluff, but her face told me everything I needed to know. The color drained from her cheeks, her perfectly manicured hand tightening around her purse. You're lying. Am I? Ask him about Kendra Williams, or about the condo he supposedly bought in Miami. More lies, but delivered with such conviction that doubt crept into her eyes. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm about to blow the whistle on his financial schemes and thought you deserved a warning. The authorities don't look kindly on those who accept stolen funds. Vanessa's breathing quickened. I didn't know. Of course you did. My voice remained level. The sudden influx of cash, the promises of a life together once he sorted things out. You knew exactly what you were doing. She stared at me for a long moment. You're her, aren't you? The wife. I smiled thinly. Let's just say I have a vested interest in seeing justice served. I stood, placing cash on the table for both our drinks. You have 24 hours to return the money, Vanessa. Then things get very, very complicated for you. As I walked away, I heard her frantically dialing her phone. By the time I reached my car, I knew Mason would be in a panic. The game had changed, but I was still 3 moves ahead. 4. I wasn't surprised when my phone began ringing incessantly. Mason calling from both his personal and work phones. Text messages piling up, each more frantic than the last. We need to talk. Call me ASAP. This is important, Lisa. Please answer your phone. I silenced the notifications and drove to the hotel where I'd been staying, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The confrontation with Vanessa had accelerated my timeline, but it had also given me something invaluable. I now knew that she was just as much a victim of Mason's manipulations as I was, albeit a willing one. My hotel room felt like a war room. Laptop open to monitor our accounts, papers spread across the bed, a notepad filled with my methodical planning. I checked our joint accounts and saw something interesting. Mason had attempted to transfer another $10,000 out, but the freeze I'd placed had prevented it. He was getting desperate. I called Diane to update her on my meeting with Vanessa and Mason's escalating panic. You took a huge risk, she scolded, but it might work in our favor. If he's rattled, he'll make mistakes. He's already trying to move more money. The bank stopped it. Perfect. That's another attempt at financial misconduct documented. But Lisa, you need to be careful. When people get cornered, they can become dangerous. Her warning wasn't misplaced. I'd seen Mason angry before, throwing a glass against the wall when a business deal fell through, punching a hole in our drywall during an argument. His temper had always simmered just below the surface, one of many red flags I'd ignored over the years. Finally, I decided to answer his call. I needed to gauge his state of mind. Lisa, thank God. His voice was strained. Where are you? We need to talk. I'm still at my sister's, I lied smoothly. What's wrong? You sound upset. He faltered. There's been a misunderstanding with the bank accounts. I tried to make a transfer for a business investment and it wouldn't go through. I almost admired his commitment to the lie. That's strange. Did you call the bank? Yes, they said something about a security hold. I need you to call them. Use your accounting expertise to sort this out. Of course, I said, keeping my voice neutral. I'll look into it tomorrow. I'm about to have dinner with Julie and the kids now. It's actually pretty urgent, Lisa. Can you do it tonight? I let the silence stretch, knowing it would make him squirm. Mason, what's really going on? You've never been this concerned about bank issues before. He sighed heavily, and I could picture him running his hand through his hair the way he did when stressed. It's complicated. A time-sensitive opportunity came up, and I need to move some funds quickly. How much money are we talking about? Another hesitation. About 50,000. The brazen lie almost made me laugh. He'd already transferred far more than that. That's a lot of money, Mason. What kind of opportunity is this? Look, I can explain everything when you get home. When are you coming back? Tomorrow evening, I said. We can talk then. After hanging up, I immediately called the bank's fraud department to alert them about Mason's attempted transfer. They confirmed it had been blocked and assured me the investigation was proceeding. Next, I called my own bank, an account Mason knew nothing about, where I'd been quietly depositing small amounts from my personal income over the years. A precaution I'd taken after watching my mother struggle financially following my parents' divorce. That account now held enough to sustain me for several months if needed. The hour was late when my burner phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. We need to meet. I've made a terrible mistake. V. Vanessa. Interesting. I considered ignoring it, but curiosity won out. When and where? Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Ridgeway Park by the fountain. I'll be there, I replied, already formulating how this unexpected meeting might fit into my plans. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing with scenarios and counter-scenarios. When dawn broke, I rose and prepared meticulously, dressing in a casual but expensive outfit that projected confidence and control. I armed myself with a small recording device Diane had provided, legal in our state as long as one party consented, to the recording. Ridgeway Park was quiet on a Sunday morning, just a few joggers and families with young children. I spotted Vanessa immediately, sitting tensely on a bench by the stone fountain, sunglasses covering her eyes despite the cloudy day. As I approached, she removed them, revealing red-rimmed eyes. She'd been crying. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice hoarse. I sat beside her, maintaining a careful distance. I'm listening. What she told me over the next 30 minutes would change everything. Not just my plan for revenge, but my understanding of exactly what Mason had been orchestrating all along. And it was far worse than I had imagined. 5. I'm not the first, Vanessa began, her voice barely above a whisper. There was another woman before me, Rebecca. She worked at the company, too. I kept my expression neutral, though my heart raced. Go on? Rebecca disappeared about a year ago. Everyone thought she'd quit suddenly, moved back to her hometown. That's what Mason told us. Vanessa twisted her hands in her lap. But last week I found something on his laptop. Emails between them. She was threatening to tell you about their affair, about the money. What money? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Mason had convinced her to invest in a business venture. She gave him her life savings, nearly $100,000. When she realized it was a scam, she demanded it back, threatened to go to the police. The recorder in my pocket captured every word as Vanessa continued, describing how Mason had systematically targeted vulnerable women, using his position and charm to extract money from them. I thought I was special, she said bitterly. He told me he'd never felt this way before, that we were going to start a new life together. I believed him. She paused, shame crossing her face. I even borrowed money from my parents' retirement fund to give him. How much? I asked quietly. 40,000. Her voice broke. They don't know. I told them I was investing it for them. I felt a strange mix of vindication and pity. And now you're worried about what happened to Rebecca? She nodded, eyes wide with fear. The last email from her said she was coming to confront him in person. There's nothing after that. Nothing. It's like she vanished. My blood ran cold. Was Mason capable of something truly sinister? The financial fraud was one thing, but this implied something much darker. Why are you telling me this? Because I think you're in danger, she said. After you approached me last night, I questioned Mason. He was different, scary. He said he would handle the situation, that I shouldn't worry about his wife much longer. I maintained my composure, though alarm bells rang in my head. Do you have copies of these emails? She nodded, pulling a flash drive from her purse. Everything? I could download. There's more. Financial documents, communications with offshore banks. He's been doing this for years, long before you were married. It's like a pattern for him. I took the drive, my mind racing. If what she was saying was true, this wasn't just about an affair or stolen savings. It was a long-running criminal enterprise. What do you want from me? I asked directly. Protection, she replied. I'll testify about everything, help you get your money back, but I need assurance I won't go to jail. And she hesitated. I'm scared of what he might do when he realizes I've turned on him. We spoke for another hour, formulating a plan. Vanessa would maintain the pretense of loyalty to Mason while secretly working with me. I would approach the authorities with the evidence from both of us. In return, I would speak to the district attorney about immunity for her cooperation. When we parted ways, I drove straight to Diane's house. This had escalated beyond a divorce case. We needed to involve law enforcement immediately. Jesus Christ, Diane muttered as we reviewed the files from Vanessa's flash drive. This guy is running a full-blown Ponzi scheme, and these communications with Rebecca. She looked up at me, her expression grave. Lisa, you need to get somewhere. Safe. Now. I'm supposed to go home tonight. Mason is expecting me. Absolutely not. We're calling the police right now. As Diane reached for her phone, mine buzzed with a text from Mason. Changed my plans. Coming to Julie's to pick you up. We need to talk privately. Be there in an hour. My sister Julie lived over 2 hours away. He knew I wasn't there. He knows, I said, showing Diane the message. He's trying to flush me out. She immediately called a contact at the police department, putting the phone on speaker as she explained the situation. Mrs. Reynolds needs to come in immediately to give a statement, the detective said after hearing a summary. And we'll need all the evidence you've gathered. If what you're saying about this Rebecca person is accurate, this could be very serious indeed. I packed up my documents and Vanessa's flash drive. As we prepared to leave for the police station, my burner phone rang. Vanessa. He knows, she said, her voice tight with panic. I don't know how, but he knows we met. He just called, asking where I was, saying we needed to meet right away. Lisa, I'm scared. Where are you now? I asked. In my car, downtown. I was shopping, trying to act normal. Drive directly to the police station on 3rd Street. I'm heading there now. Don't go anywhere else. Don't talk to Mason again. Okay, she said shakily. I'm on my way. 6. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of police interviews, search warrants, and mounting anxiety. Mason's company office was searched, yielding financial records that confirmed everything Vanessa had told me. Our home was turned inside out by forensic teams looking for any clue to Rebecca's whereabouts or Mason and Vanessa's current location. We've got a bolo out on both their vehicles and have frozen all known accounts, Detective Harlow informed me as we sat in a conference room at the police station. But he had a head start. What about the offshore accounts? The one in the Caymans? We're working with international authorities, but these things take time. Financial crimes across borders are complicated. I nodded, exhaustion settling into my bones. I hadn't slept properly in days, jumping at every sound, imagining Mason lurking around every corner. Mrs. Reynolds? Detective Harlow leaned forward, her expression serious. We need to consider the possibility that Vanessa didn't run away with your husband. Given the pattern of behavior and what happened to Rebecca Williams, there's a chance. She might be in danger. The implication hung heavy in the air. Could Mason have harmed Vanessa? Could he have done something to Rebecca? The man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years suddenly seemed like a complete stranger. I never saw violence in him, I said slowly. Anger, yes. Manipulation, definitely. But could he? I couldn't finish the thought. People can surprise us, she replied grimly, especially when cornered. A knock on the door interrupted our conversation. Another detective entered, handing Harlow a file. We've got something. Traffic cam picked up Vanessa's car heading east on Highway 16 yesterday morning. She wasn't alone in the vehicle. Mason? I asked. The detective shook his head. Can't. Tell from the angle. Someone in the passenger seat, but they're not visible. Highway 16 leads to the Lake District, Harlow mused. Lots of seasonal cabins out there, mostly empty this time of year. My mind raced. Mason's college roommate has a cabin on Lake Simmons. We've been there a few times for weekend trips. Harlow immediately dispatched officers to check the location. I provided them with everything I could remember about the cabin, its blue shutters, the dock that needed repair, the winding dirt road that led to it. While we waited for news, I stayed with Diane, who had insisted I not be alone. Her guest room became my temporary sanctuary, though sleep remained elusive. I keep thinking about those texts Mason sent me, I told her as we sat in her kitchen that evening. The way he escalated from casual to frantic. Was he just worried about the money? Or was there something more sinister in his plans for me? Diane handed me a cup of tea. Don't go there, Lisa. The police are handling this. Your job right now is to stay safe and take care of yourself. My phone rang. Detective Harlow. We found the cabin, she said without preamble. It's been recently occupied, but no one's there now. There are signs of a struggle, Mrs. Reynolds. Blood on the floor. My hand tightened around the phone. Whose blood? We don't know yet. Forensics is processing the scene. 3 hours later, preliminary results came back. The blood matched Vanessa's type, enough to indicate serious injury, but not necessarily death. Mason's fingerprints were everywhere as expected for a place he frequented, but they also found something unexpected. A hidden room beneath the cabin, accessible through a trapdoor under a rug. It's been modified recently, Harlow explained when I came back to the buy station. Soundproofed. There were restraints bolted to the wall. The implications made me physically ill. I excused myself to the restroom, where I vomited until my stomach was empty, cold sweat beading on my forehead. When I returned, Harlow had more news. We've managed to track Mason's cell phone to a motel just outside of Carson City, Nevada. Local police are on their way now. Hope flared briefly, but was quickly extinguished when she continued. The clerk confirmed a man matching Mason's description checked in last night, alone. What about Vanessa? No sign of her, but they found her purse in a dumpster behind the motel. Her wallet was inside, ID and credit cards still there. Only her phone is missing. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was horrifying. Mason had never planned to run away with Vanessa. She was just his latest mark, another woman he'd used and discarded. He knew we were onto him, I said quietly. After I confronted Vanessa, she questioned him. He must have realized she was a liability. Harlow nodded grimly. We're treating this as a potential homicide investigation now. And Mrs. Reynolds, I need to be clear. Until we apprehend your husband, you're in danger. We'd like to place you in protective custody. The next 6 hours were a blur of police activity, phone calls, and mounting dread. The station hummed with tension as officers launched a full-scale search for Mason, Vanessa, and any leads to Rebecca Williams's disappearance. I sat in an interview room, clutching a paper cup of bitter coffee that had long since gone cold, as Detective Harlow provided intermittent updates. We've got officers at your house, Mrs. Reynolds, she reported around 8 p.m. No sign of your husband, but they're executing the search warrant now. His office has been secured as well. I nodded numbly. The reality of the situation was finally sinking in. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was potentially about life and death. The thought that Mason, the man I'd shared a bed with, for 8 years could be involved in someone's disappearance seemed inconceivable. Yet the evidence was mounting with each passing hour. "What about Vanessa's car?" I asked. "Found abandoned in the parking garage 2 blocks from here." Detective Harlow's expression was grim. "Security cameras show her arriving and parking, but she never exits the stairwell. We're reviewing all footage from surrounding businesses now." My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I have them both. Want to see them again? Follow my instructions precisely." Attached was a photo of Vanessa, clearly frightened but unharmed, holding today's newspaper. I handed the phone to Detective Harlow, my hand trembling. "It's him." Her eyes narrowed as she read the message. "This changes everything." She immediately called in her superior and a tech specialist. Within minutes, the interview room transformed into a command center for what had officially become a kidnapping investigation. "We'll need to trace this number, set up a recording system for any calls," the tech explained, taking my phone, "and prepare you if he makes contact again." "Prepare me?" I echoed. "We need to keep him talking, get as much information as possible. About his location and their condition," Detective Harlow explained. "You'll have to respond to his text, but we'll tell you exactly what to say." The next message arrived 20 minutes later. "No police. I'll know. Come alone to where we first met. Midnight. Bring all evidence you've collected or they both die." My mind raced. Where we first met. The Shoreline Cafe, a small coffee shop on the waterfront where I'd been studying for my accounting certification. Mason had asked to share my table during the morning rush. He'd been charming, confident. Everything my exhausted graduate student self had found impressive. How ironic that he'd chosen the site of his first manipulation for this final confrontation. "It's a coffee shop on the waterfront," I told Detective Harlow, "but it closes at 9 p.m. "Perfect," she said, surprising me. "An empty location gives us tactical advantages. We can secure the perimeter beforehand." The plan they developed was methodical. I would appear to arrive alone, wearing a concealed wire and tracking device. SWAT team members would be positioned strategically around the cafe and adjacent buildings. Snipers would establish sightlines from nearby rooftops. My job was simple. Keep Mason talking until they could determine if Vanessa and Rebecca were on site and move in to secure them. "We don't believe he has Rebecca with him," Detective Harlow clarified. "The photo only showed Vanessa, but we need to get information about Rebecca's whereabouts." As midnight approached, I found myself in the back of an unmarked police van, being fitted with a nearly invisible earpiece and wire. The tactical team leader, Captain Rodriguez, ran through the plan one final time. "Remember, Mrs. Reynolds, your only responsibility is your own safety. Don't try to be a hero. Don't antagonize him. Just keep him talking until we can determine the best moment to move in." I nodded, though my mouth had gone dry with fear. In all my careful planning for revenge, I had never imagined a scenario like this, where lives potentially hung in the balance. "What if he doesn't have Vanessa there?" I asked. "What if it's a trap?" "Then we abort and extract you immediately," Rodriguez assured me. "We have contingencies for every scenario." But as the van parked 3 blocks from the cafe and I prepared to begin my walk to the meeting point, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something. Mason was many things: a liar, a cheat, a thief. But he was also methodical and intelligent. He wouldn't arrange this confrontation without having multiple escape routes planned. The waterfront was eerily quiet at this hour, the usual tourist bustle replaced by empty boardwalks and shuttered shops. My footsteps echoed on the wooden planks as I approached the darkened cafe. Through my earpiece, I could hear the tactical, "Team's terse updates. Subject approaching from the north. No visual on any hostages yet. Alpha team in position. Bravo team ready." And then I saw him, standing in the shadows beside the cafe's outdoor seating area. Mason looked different, haggard, unshaven, his usual polished appearance replaced by something wild and dangerous. I stopped about 15 feet away. "Where's Vanessa?" I called, my voice steadier than I felt. "Inside," he replied, gesturing toward the cafe's darkened interior. "Along with everything else you're looking for. I want to see her first." He laughed, a harsh sound that bore no resemblance to the warm chuckle I'd once loved. "You're not exactly in a position to make demands, Lisa, but fine." He pulled out his phone, tapped a few buttons, and held up the screen. I could see a live video feed of Vanessa, bound to a chair in what looked like a storage room, surrounded by coffee supplies and cleaning products. The cafe's back room. "Now, where's the evidence?" he demanded. I patted my bag. "Everything's here. The bank records, the emails, Vanessa's flash drive. Your whole operation, Mason." His eyes narrowed. "Slide it over." "Not until you tell me about Rebecca Williams." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, that I knew the name. "Rebecca made her choices," he said coldly. "Just like Vanessa did. Just like you did." "Did her choices include disappearing without a trace?" I pressed, following the script Detective Harlow had prepared. "What happened to her, Mason?" He took a step forward, and I heard the tactical team tense through my earpiece. "Ready to move on command," someone murmured. "Rebecca got greedy," Mason said, his voice low and menacing. "She thought she could threaten me, expose everything I'd built. I couldn't allow that." "So you killed her?" I asked bluntly. He laughed again. "Always so direct, Lisa. It's what I loved about you once upon a time." "No, I didn't kill her. I simply helped her disappear." "Where is she?" "Somewhere no one will ever find her." A smile played at the corners of his mouth, chilling me to the bone. "Now, enough talking. The evidence. Slide it over, or Vanessa joins her." I reached into my bag as if to retrieve the files, stalling for time. "How many others were there, Mason? Before Rebecca? Before Vanessa? How long have you been doing this?" His patience was clearly wearing thin. "The bag, Lisa. Now." "Stand by," the voice in my ear whispered. "We've located the hostage, preparing to breach." I needed to keep him distracted just a little longer. "You know what I don't understand? Why the elaborate schemes? You're smart, Mason. You could have made legitimate money." "Legitimate money?" he scoffed. "Do you have any idea how boring that is? The same grind day after day, for what? A mediocre house in a mediocre neighborhood, with a mediocre wife who never understood me?" The insult stung, but I pushed past it. "And this was better? Running from the law, hurting people who trusted you?" "It was exhilarating," he said, his eyes gleaming with an almost feverish light. "You never lived, Lisa. You just existed, with your spreadsheets and your careful plans. I was alive. Moving in 10 seconds, the earpiece crackled. "Keep him talking." "So what was the end game?" I asked. "You take their money? Then what? Kill them all eventually?" "Not all of them," he said with a shrug. "Just the ones who became problems." "Like me?" His expression hardened. "You should have stayed oblivious, Lisa. You were good at that." "Now!" the voice in my ear commanded, and suddenly the night erupted into chaos. Tactical officers swarmed from all directions, shouting commands. Bright lights flooded the area, momentarily blinding me. I dropped to the ground as instructed during the briefing, covering my head with my arms. But Mason had been prepared. As the officers closed in, a deafening explosion rocked the cafe behind him. The force of the blast sent debris flying across the boardwalk, and thick smoke billowed into the night sky. "Officer down! Officer down!" someone shouted through my earpiece. In the confusion, Mason vanished. I felt strong hands grabbing me, pulling me to safety behind a concrete barrier. Detective Harlow's voice cut through the chaos. "The hostage is secure. We got her out the back before the explosion. Are you hurt?" I shook my head, stunned by the turn of events. Mason? We'll find him, she assured me, but her eyes reflected the grim reality. He had escaped, at least for now. As emergency vehicles converged on the scene, paramedics attended to Vanessa, who was shaken but largely unharmed. When she was cleared to speak, Detective Harlow and I sat with her in the back of an ambulance. He was waiting at my car in the parking garage, she explained, her voice hoarse from the smoke. He had a gun, said he knew I'd betrayed him, that he'd been watching me. He forced me to drive to some warehouse first, where he tied me up. Then he brought me to the cafe about an hour before you arrived. Did he say anything about Rebecca Williams? Detective Harlow asked. Vanessa nodded, tears welling in her eyes. He bragged about it, said she was stored somewhere cold, and that I'd join her if I didn't cooperate. He seemed proud of himself. A cold shiver ran through me. Stored somewhere cold could only mean one thing, and it confirmed our worst fears about Rebecca's. Oh, did he mention any specific locations, properties, storage units, anything like that? The detective pressed. No, just that. Vanessa hesitated, swallowing hard. Just that he had several long-term investments buried away. That's how he phrased it. Buried away. Detective Harlow's expression darkened. We need to compile a list of every property connected to him, every place he's ever mentioned, every location with significance. Back at the station, as dawn broke over the city, the investigation expanded exponentially. Mason's face was plastered across every news outlet, a massive manhunt underway. Financial crimes experts combed through the evidence I'd gathered, uncovering a network of shell companies and fraudulent investments dating back over a decade. He's been at this much longer than we thought, the lead investigator explained, spreading documents across the conference table. We've identified at least 6 women before Rebecca who invested significant sums with him. All of them subsequently disappeared or died under questionable circumstances. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The man I married, the man I'd built a life with, wasn't just a con artist. He was potentially a serial killer who had been operating right under my nose for years. How could I not have known? I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. Detective Harlow rested a hand on my shoulder. Predators like this are exceptionally good at compartmentalizing their lives. Don't blame yourself. But it was impossible not to. Every memory now felt tainted. Every moment of our marriage recontextualized by this horrifying new knowledge. Had I been merely a convenient cover for his activities? A respectable facade behind which he could operate? Or had I been a potential victim all along, spared only because I'd discovered his financial misdeeds before he could silence me? These questions haunted me as the investigation continued through the next day. I was placed in protective custody at a hotel under a false name, with an officer stationed outside my door. The police had reason to believe Mason would come after me, either for revenge or to eliminate a witness. Sleep eluded me, my mind racing, with fragmented memories and terrifying possibilities. Around 3 a.m., I gave up trying and sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. My phone buzzed with a text from a blocked number. You think you've won? You haven't even begun to understand what you're dealing with. Sweet dreams, Lisa. While you still can. I immediately alerted the officer outside my door, who called it in. The tech team would try to trace it, but we all knew it would likely lead nowhere. Mason was too careful for that. The next morning, forensic teams made a grim discovery at an abandoned property registered to one of Mason's shell companies. In the basement freezer, they found human remains believed to be Rebecca Williams. DNA testing would be required for confirmation, but her distinctive emerald ring, visible in photos her family had provided, left little doubt. I threw up when Detective Harlow told me, the horror of it all finally overwhelming my carefully maintained composure. This wasn't just a financial crime anymore. It was a murder investigation, and I was married to the prime suspect. As the day, progressed, more discoveries were made. A self-storage unit rented under a fake name contained detailed files on all of Mason's victims, including me. My blood ran cold as I flipped through the folder bearing my name, seeing surveillance photos of me taken before we'd even met. Notes about my routines, my finances, my career prospects. He targeted you, Detective Harlow said softly, just like the others. But why marry me? The others were just investments he discarded. Your accounting background, she suggested. Access to financial systems, knowledge that would be valuable to him, and a legitimate front for his activities. It made a sickening kind of sense. I had been useful in ways the others hadn't been, which had extended my lifespan in his world. The thought made me physically ill again. As night fell, I returned to my hotel room under heavy guard. The investigation was moving rapidly now, with multiple law enforcement agencies involved. Mason's face was being broadcast nationwide, his assets frozen, his escape routes presumably closing by the hour. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still a step ahead. Mason had always excelled at contingency planning, at seeing 3 moves beyond everyone else. The explosion at the cafe hadn't been improvised. It had been prepared in advance, a calculated exit strategy. My suspicions were confirmed at precisely 9:43 p.m., when every electronic device in my hotel room, television, phone, tablet, simultaneously received the same video message. Somehow, he had hacked into the hotel's systems, identified my room, and targeted me specifically. The video showed Mason, now clean-shaven and with dyed hair, sitting in what appeared to be an airport lounge. "Hello, Lisa," he said, smiling that charming smile that had once made my heart race. "By the time you see this, I'll be beyond your reach. I wanted you to know that I always admired your intelligence. Out of all of them, you came the closest to understanding the game. Not close enough, though." He held up a passport, not his own, but one with a different name and his new appearance. "The accounts you found were just decoys, darling. The real money is somewhere you'll never track it. The women you're so concerned about, they serve their purpose. Business investments with diminishing returns. It was nothing personal." His expression hardened. "Until you made it personal. Now it's a matter of principle. You can look over your shoulder for the rest of your life, wondering when I'll return to finish our conversation. Or..." He held up a piece of paper with an account, number and access codes. "This is a gesture of goodwill. $5 million in an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet. Enough for you to disappear, start fresh, never look back. Consider it a divorce settlement." My hands shook as I watched, repulsed by his audacity. "All you have to do is destroy the evidence. Recant your statements. Tell them you made it all up because you were a jealous, vengeful wife. The funds will be released to you automatically once the charges are dropped. Otherwise..." He shrugged, his meaning clear. "You have 24 hours to decide. Choose wisely, Lisa. You always were good at cost-benefit analysis." The video ended, and I immediately called Detective Harlow. Within minutes, a technical team arrived to secure the devices and trace the hack. But I already knew it would be too late. The airport lounge could be anywhere in the world. The video likely recorded hours earlier. "He's offering me money to help him escape justice," I told Detective Harlow, still shaking with rage and fear. "It's a common tactic," she said. "Try to turn a witness, create doubt about their credibility. We won't let him succeed." But as the night wore on and the investigation continued, a disturbing possibility took root in my mind. What if I could use Mason's offer against him? What if I pretended to accept, to lure him into a trap of my own making? It was a dangerous gambit, one the police would never officially sanction. But as I lay awake for the second night in a row, I began to formulate a plan that might finally turn the tables on the master manipulator who had nearly destroyed my life. Dawn arrived with no real solutions, just the growing certainty that Mason would always be one step ahead of conventional law enforcement tactics. I'd spent the night researching cryptocurrency transactions, digital forensics, and the psychology of narcissistic sociopaths. The more I learned, the more convinced. I became that only I could end this nightmare. Detective Harlow arrived at my hotel room at 7 a.m., bringing coffee and a grim expression. "We've got confirmation on the remains. It's Rebecca Williams." She paused, giving me a moment to process this before continuing. "And there may be others. We've identified 3 more properties connected to Mason through various shell companies. Search warrants are being executed as we speak." I nodded, unsurprised but still sickened. "Have you been able to trace the video?" Our tech team worked through the night. The signal was bounced through multiple servers across different countries. We've narrowed it down to somewhere in Southeast Asia, but that's still a massive area to search. Southeast Asia, a region with numerous countries, complex extradition laws, and endless places to hide. Mason had chosen his escape route carefully. "He won't stay there," I said with certainty. "It's just another misdirection. Mason hates humidity and he's allergic to certain tropical foods. He'd be miserable there long term." Detective Harlow looked at me sharply. "That's useful information. Where do you think he would go?" I considered the question carefully. Somewhere with financial privacy laws. Somewhere cosmopolitan enough to satisfy his tastes, but with enough anonymity that he could reinvent himself. Switzerland, maybe. Or Monaco. She made notes, nodding thoughtfully. "What about the cryptocurrency offer? Do you think it's legitimate?" "The money probably exists," I replied. "Mason wouldn't risk a bluff that could be easily exposed. But there's undoubtedly a trap built into the transaction. We could try to trace it, use it to locate him." I shook my head. "He'd anticipate that. The funds are probably routed through so many layers of encryption and anonymous wallets that they'd be impossible to trace back to him." What I didn't share with Detective Harlow was the plan that had been forming in my mind throughout the sleepless night, a plan that walked the fine line between clever strategy and reckless endangerment, a plan that the police would never approve. After she left, promising to return with any updates, I made a call to someone who hadn't been part of my life for years. My college roommate, Eliza, who had gone on to become one of the most respected ethical hackers in the cybersecurity industry. "Lisa Reynolds," she answered with surprise. "It's been, 5 years?" "At least," I admitted. "And I wish I was calling under better circumstances." "I've been following the news," she said, her tone softening. "Your husband is all over the darknet forums. There's quite a bounty building for information on his whereabouts, both from law enforcement and from some less official sources." That caught my attention. "What kind of less official sources?" "The kind that don't appreciate someone drawing so much heat to their financial ecosystems. Your husband moved a lot of money through channels that prefer to stay in the shadows. Now those channels are under scrutiny." An unexpected advantage. Mason had made enemies beyond just the women he'd victimized and the authorities pursuing him. "I need help, Eliza. Off the record." There was a pause. Then, a soft chuckle. "The straight-laced accountant needs something off the record?" Now I'm intrigued. I explained about the cryptocurrency offer, about my suspicions that it was both genuine and a trap, about my conviction that conventional methods wouldn't be enough to catch Mason. "You're talking about setting up a counter-trap," she said when I finished, "using his own bait against him." "Exactly. But I need someone who understands the technical side better than I do." "It's dangerous, Lisa. Not just physically. If you get caught trying to entrap him, you could face legal consequences yourself." "I know, but I can't let him escape. Not after what he's done." Eliza sighed. "Send me the access codes from the video. Let me see what I'm working with." While waiting for Eliza to analyze the cryptocurrency information, I made 2 more calls. One to Diane, who was appalled by my suggested plan, but reluctantly agreed to provide legal counsel if needed. and another to a former client who specialized in private security. By early afternoon, Eliza called back. "It's sophisticated, I'll give him that. The wallet exists and contains exactly $5 million in mixed cryptocurrencies, but it's set up with a dead man's switch." Meaning? If anyone tries to access it without following precise protocols, the funds automatically transfer elsewhere and alert him. Additionally, accessing it would install tracking software on whatever device you use, giving him your exact location. Just as I'd suspected. Can you work around it? Maybe, she said cautiously. But we'd need to create a perfect simulation. Make him believe you've accessed it according to his rules while actually containing the tracking software in a virtual environment. It would give us a window to trace his monitoring back to its source. How long would that window be? Minutes at most. He'd realize something was wrong as soon as the tracking data seemed inconsistent. Minutes might be enough, I mused. If we can narrow down his location, the authorities could move in. Lisa. Eliza's voice turned serious. This isn't a game. You're dealing with someone who has killed multiple women. Someone who planned this escape meticulously. If he realizes you're trying to trick him, he won't just run. He'll retaliate. I know, I said quietly. But I'm already a target. At least this way, I'm not just waiting for him to make his move. After several more discussions and careful planning, we agreed on a strategy. Eliza would create a controlled environment for accessing the cryptocurrency wallet, a virtual machine on a dedicated computer that would appear to comply with Mason's GEO conditions while actually running a sophisticated trace program. The transaction would seem to proceed normally from Mason's perspective, but the funds would never actually move. Meanwhile, I would appear to be cooperating with his demands. I'd make a show of withdrawing my statements to the police, claiming emotional distress and confusion. This public recantation would serve as the signal to Mason that I was accepting his offer. Detective Harlow was not pleased when I outlined a sanitized version of the plan. "This is completely unorthodox and potentially disastrous," she objected. "You'd be deliberately misleading an ongoing investigation and placing yourself at extreme risk." "I'm not asking for the department's approval," I clarified. "I'm merely informing you of my decision to withdraw my cooperation temporarily. As a private citizen, that's my right." "A right that could get you killed," she countered, "and potentially jeopardize our entire case against him. Or it could be our best chance to locate him before he disappears forever." After hours of debate, we reached a compromise. I would proceed with my plan to appear to accept Mason's offer, but with significant modifications. The police would be informed of every step, no matter how illegal it might seem on the surface. A special task force would be assembled, operating, with enough discretion to prevent Mason from detecting their involvement. The next 24 hours were a carefully choreographed dance of apparent capitulation. I held a tearful press conference, claiming that stress and jealousy had led me to fabricate accusations against my husband. I publicly apologized to Mason and asked for forgiveness. Local news ate it up. The scorned wife admitting to a vindictive lie made for sensational headlines. Behind the scenes, Eliza prepared the technical aspects of our counter-trap, working from a secure location with equipment provided by the Cybercrime Division. The cryptocurrency wallet would be accessed at precisely 9 p.m. the following evening, giving the international team time to prepare for potential locations where Mason might be hiding. "We've established surveillance at major transportation hubs in 6 countries," Detective Harlow informed me. "Based on your insights about his preferences and his known associates, we've prioritized Switzerland, Monaco, and parts of northern Italy." As the deadline approached, I was moved to a different hotel under heavy security. The room was outfitted with specialized equipment and surrounded by plainclothes officers. If Mason had someone watching me, which we had to assume he did, they would see only a woman who had capitulated to fear and greed, preparing to accept a payoff. At 8:45 p.m., I received another video message. Mason, still disguised but recognizable, to me, sat in what appeared to be an upscale apartment with modern furnishings and a view of mountains through the window. "I'm pleased you've made the sensible choice, Lisa," he said, his voice smooth as ever. "I always respected your practical nature. In 15 minutes, you'll receive final instructions for accessing the funds. Follow them precisely. Any deviation, any attempt to trace or trap, and the offer expires permanently, along with any guarantee of your safety." I showed the video to the technical team, who immediately began analyzing every pixel for clues to his location. The mountain view might be identifiable. The furnishings might match a specific hotel or rental property. At precisely 9 p.m., the instructions arrived, a complex series of steps involving multiple verification codes and precise timing. Eliza, connected via secure line, guided me through the process using the specialized equipment. "He's good," she muttered as we navigated the digital maze he'd created. Each step includes verification that would expose any conventional tracking attempt, but our shadow system should mask our true intentions. After 17 tense minutes, we completed the procedure. On the screen, a confirmation message appeared. "Transfer initiated. Funds will be available within 24 hours pending verification of continued compliance." "Now we wait," Eliza said. "My trace program is working backwards through his verification system. If we're lucky, we'll get a location ping when he checks to confirm the transaction was completed correctly." The next hour was excruciating. I paced the hotel room, jumping at every sound, while the technical team monitored their equipment for any sign that our trace was successful. Detective Harlow remained on standby, coordinating with international law enforcement partners who were poised to move the moment we had a location. At 10:37 p.m., Eliza's voice came through with barely contained excitement. "We've got something. A verification check from an IP address in Lugano, Switzerland." The team erupted into action, relaying the information to Swiss authorities. Satellite images of Lugano appeared on screens, with technical analysts narrowing the location further based on the digital signature. "It's an apartment complex on Via Serafino Balestra," one of them announced. "High-end rentals, mostly short-term." Detective Harlow was already on the phone with the Swiss police, coordinating a tactical approach. Given Mason's history of violence and explosives, they would need to proceed with extreme caution. "They're moving into position now," she reported. "The building is being quietly evacuated. They should be ready to breach within 30 minutes. Those 30 minutes felt like years. I couldn't sit, couldn't eat the sandwiches someone had brought in, couldn't do anything but stare at the live feed from the Operation Command Center in Switzerland. Tactical officers in dark uniforms positioned themselves around a sleek, modern building with a view of Lake Lugano and the mountains beyond. "Target apartment identified," came the update. "Heat signatures indicate one person inside, consistent with our suspect's profile." At 11:23 p.m., the order was given. Swiss tactical officers breached the apartment from multiple entry points simultaneously, using flashbang grenades to disorient the occupant. The live feed switched to body cameras, the images chaotic and jarring as officers swept through a luxurious apartment. "Clear," called one officer in accented English. "Bathroom clear. Kitchen clear. Bedroom." A pause. "We have a body." My heart stopped. A body. Not an arrest, not a confrontation, but a body. The camera steadied on a king-sized bed where a man lay motionless, a neat hole in his temple and a gun still clutched in his right hand. The face was different. Dyed hair, some subtle cosmetic alterations, but unmistakably Mason. "Is he—" I couldn't finish the question. "Deceased," confirmed the Swiss officer in charge. "Appears to be self-inflicted. Time of death very recent. Within the hour." Within the hour. After our trace had pinged his location, he must have realized he'd been found, that his elaborate escape plan had failed. In the days that followed, the full extent of Mason's crimes became clearer. Forensic accountants uncovered a financial web spanning more than 15 years. At least 11 women had been victimized, their combined losses totaling over $7 million. Of those 11, 5 were confirmed dead, including Rebecca Williams, their bodies found in locations connected to Mason's various shell companies. The remains of the other 6 women hadn't been located, but given the pattern, authorities held little hope of finding them alive. Mason had been methodical in his predation, selecting victims who were financially successful but socially isolated, women whose disappearances might not immediately raise alarms. His suicide left many questions unanswered. Had he always intended to kill himself rather than face justice, or had our trap pushed him to a desperate final act? The note found beside him offered little clarity. Game over, no reset button, the final move is mine. Even in death, Mason had sought to maintain control, to frame his suicide as a choice rather than a consequence of his actions. It was consistent with the narcissistic personality disorder that forensic psychologists would later identify as central to his pathology. For me, the aftermath was a complex tangle of emotions: relief that he could no longer hurt anyone, grief for the life I'd thought we had, guilt over the victims I hadn't known about, and a strange, hollow emptiness where closure should have been. There would be no trial, no opportunity to confront him with the full impact of his crimes, no chance to ask the questions that still haunted me. Had any of it been real? Had he ever actually loved me? Or had I simply been a useful accessory to his schemes? When had he first decided I might eventually need to be eliminated? The night he transferred our savings, or long before that? 1 month after Mason's death, I sat in Diane's office, finalizing the dissolution of his estate. The process was complicated by ongoing civil suits from the families of his victims, all of whom had legitimate claims to whatever assets remained. The good news is that Eliza's team managed to recover a significant portion of the stolen funds, Diane explained. About $4.3 million so far, with more potentially recoverable. The court has established a victims' compensation fund that will distribute it proportionally. What about the properties? I asked, thinking of the grim discoveries made at several of them. Most will be liquidated, the proceeds added to the compensation fund, though there's talk of converting one into a memorial for the victims. She hesitated, then added gently, "The families have asked if you would be involved in planning it." I looked up in surprise. Me? Why would they want that? I was married to him. I lived with him while he was doing those things. Because you stopped him, Diane said simply. If you hadn't discovered that initial transfer, if you hadn't investigated, if you hadn't been brave enough to confront him, who knows how many more women might have been hurt? I wasn't sure I deserved their gratitude. I hadn't realized what Mason was until his crimes directly affected me. How many warning signs had I ignored over the years, dismissing them as quirks or stress-related behavior? But perhaps participation in the memorial could be part of my own healing process, a way to honor the women whose lives had been cut short by the man I'd once loved. I'd be honored to help, I told Diane. Just, not right away. I need some time first. Time to process, to grieve, to rebuild. The trauma of those events had left deep scars, both emotional and practical. My career had been disrupted by months of investigation and media attention. My personal identity had been shattered and would need to be reconstructed from the ground up. Even my financial security, once the bedrock of my confidence, had been compromised by the legal complexities of Mason's crimes. 6 months after Mason's death, I made a decision. Using what remained of my personal savings, funds that had never been commingled with Mason's money, I booked a one-way ticket to New Zealand. The trip we'd once planned as a couple would now become my solo journey, a symbolic reclaiming of the future he had nearly stolen from me. Before leaving, I visited Rebecca Williams' family, a pilgrimage of sorts to acknowledge the human cost of Mason's evil. They welcomed me with unexpected warmth, sharing stories of their daughter's life and dreams. She was studying to be an environmental lawyer, her mother told me, showing photographs of a young woman with bright eyes and a determined smile. She wanted to protect the natural world for future generations. She would have been good at it, her father added. Rebecca never backed down from a fight when she believed in her cause. I recognized something of myself in their descriptions. The same determination, the same refusal to surrender when faced with injustice. Perhaps that quality was what had drawn Mason to us both, a strength he sought to exploit and ultimately destroy. "I'm so sorry I didn't stop him sooner," I said, the words inadequate for the magnitude of their loss. Rebecca's mother took my hands in hers. "You couldn't have known. And when you did know, you acted. That's all anyone can do." Their forgiveness was a gift I hadn't expected and wasn't sure I deserved, but it lightened something in my heart as I prepared for my journey. New Zealand was everything I'd imagined and more: breathtaking landscapes, kind people, and a sense of distance from the horrors I'd left behind. I spent 3 months traveling the country, hiking its famous trails, sleeping under stars unpolluted by city lights, and slowly rediscovering my capacity for joy. Along the way, I began writing, first in private journals, then in a blog that unexpectedly gained followers. People were drawn to the story of a woman rebuilding her life after unimaginable betrayal, finding wisdom in my reflections on trust, resilience, and the human capacity for both terrible cruelty and extraordinary kindness. The blog led to speaking, engagements, first small community groups, then larger venues. I shared what I'd learned about financial protection, about the warning signs of emotional manipulation, about the importance of maintaining one's independence even within the most seemingly perfect relationship. 2 years after Mason's death, I published a memoir titled Hidden Accounts: How I Survived My Husband's Double Life. The book became an unexpected bestseller, resonating with readers far beyond those who had followed the sensational news coverage of Mason's crimes. Critics praised its unflinching honesty, its refusal to cast me as either a perfect victim or a flawless hero. I had made mistakes, missed signs, surrendered pieces of my autonomy in ways that had made me vulnerable. Acknowledging these truths didn't excuse Mason's actions, but offered valuable lessons for others. The book's success brought financial security and a new career as an advocate for domestic abuse survivors, with a particular focus on financial abuse, the controlling behaviors that often precede physical violence. I established a foundation that provided both emergency assistance and long-term financial education to women leaving dangerous relationships. On the 5th anniversary of discovering that fateful transfer, I stood on a stage in Sydney, addressing a conference of financial security experts, law enforcement officials, and domestic violence counselors. Financial independence isn't just about money, I told them. It's about agency, about the freedom to make choices based on your own well-being rather than fear or coercion. When we help survivors secure their financial future, we're not just addressing practical needs, we're restoring their sense of self-determination. After the talk, a young woman approached me, clutching a dog-eared copy of my book. "You saved my life," she said simply. "I was with someone like him. Reading your story gave me the courage to leave before—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Before he could take everything," I completed for her. "I'm so glad you found your way out." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "How do you do it? Move forward without letting fear consume you?" It was a question I'd been asked countless times, and my answer had evolved over the years. "I don't try to forget or pretend it never happened," I told her. "That experience is part of who I am now, but I refuse to let it define my entire identity or determine my future. Each decision I make that's truly mine, each moment of joy I claim for myself, is an act of reclamation." Later that evening, I walked along Sydney Harbor, watching the lights reflect on the water. My phone buzzed with a message from Eliza, who had become a close friend in the years since we'd worked together to trace Mason. "Just heard your talk was a triumph. Drinks to celebrate when you're back stateside?" I smiled and replied affirmatively. My life now included a circle of strong, supportive friends who knew my full story and loved me not despite it, but with complete acceptance of the complex person I had become. As I gazed out at the harbor, I felt the familiar mixture of emotions that Mason's memory still evoked: sadness for what might have been, anger at his betrayal, gratitude for my eventual escape. She wanted to protect the natural world for future generations. She would have been good at it, her father added. Rebecca never backed down from a fight when she believed in her cause. I recognized something of myself in their descriptions, the same determination, the same refusal to surrender when faced with injustice. Perhaps that quality was what had drawn Mason to us both, a strength he sought to exploit and ultimately destroy. "I'm so sorry I didn't stop him sooner," I said, the words inadequate for the magnitude of their loss. Rebecca's mother took my hands in hers. "You couldn't have known. And when you did know, you acted. That's all anyone can do." Their forgiveness was a gift I hadn't expected and wasn't sure I deserved, but it lightened something in my heart as I prepared for my journey. New Zealand was everything I'd imagined and more: breathtaking landscapes, kind people, and a sense of distance from the horrors I'd left behind. I spent 3 months traveling the country, hiking its famous trails, sleeping under stars unpolluted by city lights, and slowly rediscovering my capacity for joy. Along the way, I began writing, first in private journals, then in a blog that unexpectedly gained followers. People were drawn to the story of a woman rebuilding her life after unimaginable betrayal, finding wisdom in my reflections on trust, resilience, and the human capacity for both terrible cruelty and extraordinary kindness. The blog led to speaking, engagements, first small community groups, then larger venues. I shared what I'd learned about financial protection, about the warning signs of emotional manipulation, about the importance of maintaining one's independence even within the most seemingly perfect relationship. 2 years after Mason's death, I published a memoir titled Hidden Accounts: How I Survived My Husband's Double Life. The book became an unexpected bestseller, resonating with readers far beyond those who had followed the sensational news coverage of Mason's crimes. Critics praised its unflinching honesty, its refusal to cast me as either a perfect victim or a flawless hero. I had made mistakes, missed signs, surrendered pieces of my autonomy in ways that had made me vulnerable. Acknowledging these truths didn't excuse Mason's actions, but offered valuable lessons for others. The book's success brought financial security and a new career as an advocate for domestic abuse survivors, with a particular focus on financial abuse, the controlling behaviors that often precede physical violence. I established a foundation that provided both emergency assistance and long-term financial education to women leaving dangerous relationships. On the 5th anniversary of discovering that fateful transfer, I stood on a stage in Sydney, addressing a conference of financial security experts, law enforcement officials, and domestic violence counselors. Financial independence isn't just about money, I told them. It's about agency, about the freedom to make choices based on your own well-being rather than fear or coercion. When we help survivors secure their financial future, we're not just addressing practical needs, we're restoring their sense of self-determination. After the talk, a young woman approached me, clutching a dog-eared copy of my book. "You saved my life," she said simply. "I was with someone like him. Reading your story gave me the courage to leave before—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Before he could take everything," I completed for her. "I'm so glad you found your way out." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "How do you do it?" Move forward without letting fear consume you? It was a question I'd been asked countless times, and my answer had evolved over the years. I don't try to forget or pretend it never happened, I told her. That experience is part of who I am now, but I refuse to let it define my entire identity or determine my future. Each decision I make that's truly mine, each moment of joy I claim for myself, is an act of reclamation. Later that evening, I walked along Sydney Harbor, watching the lights reflect on the water. My phone buzzed with a message from Eliza, who had become a close friend in the years since we'd worked together to trace Mason. Just heard your talk was a triumph. Drinks to celebrate when you're back stateside? I smiled and replied affirmatively. My life now included a circle of strong, supportive friends who knew my full story and loved me not despite it, but with complete acceptance of the complex person I had become. As I gazed out at the harbor, I felt the familiar mixture of emotions that Mason's memory still evoked: sadness for what might have been, anger at his betrayal, gratitude for my eventual escape. The anger that had once consumed me had gradually transformed into something more constructive, a commitment to preventing others from experiencing similar pain. My phone buzzed with a notification from my assistant. Dr. Levinson confirmed. For 3 p.m. Files sent to your secure email. Dr. Calvin Levinson was a forensic psychologist who had extensively studied Mason's case, along with similar predators. We were collaborating on a research project examining the patterns of financial predation and developing early warning systems that might help identify such schemes before they claimed more victims. Back in my hotel room, I opened the files he'd sent, interview transcripts with former associates of Mason's, psychological assessments, and a preliminary draft of our research paper. The work was emotionally challenging, but necessary. Understanding how Mason's mind had worked might help protect countless others from similar predators. As I reviewed the materials, a particular passage in one of the transcripts caught my attention: an interview with James Wexler, a former colleague of Mason's from his earliest days in finance. Reynolds always had this theory, Wexler had told the interviewer. He called it the vulnerability matrix. He believed everyone had a price or a pressure point, some combination of financial need, emotional dependency, or social insecurity that could be leveraged to control them. He studied people like they were puzzles to solve, looking for the weak spots in their armor. The description sent a chill down my spine, so perfectly capturing Mason's methodical approach to manipulation. I made a note to discuss this concept with Dr. Levinson during our meeting. At precisely 3 p.m., I met Dr. Levinson in the hotel's conference room. He was a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a deliberate manner of speaking that reflected his analytical mind. Ms. Reynolds, thank you for continuing to participate in this research, he said, shaking my hand firmly. Your insights have been invaluable. I found the Wexler transcript particularly interesting, I replied, getting straight to business. The description of Mason's vulnerability matrix seems significant. Dr. Levinson nodded, his expression grave. Indeed, it confirms what we've suspected, that his predation was highly systematic rather than opportunistic. Reynolds didn't simply take advantage of vulnerabilities he encountered. He actively cataloged and categorized them for future exploitation. Like a hunter studying his prey's habits, I murmured. Precisely. And what makes men like Reynolds particularly dangerous is their ability to present a perfectly crafted persona to each potential victim, becoming exactly what that person needs or wants in that moment. We spent the next 2 hours dissecting case details, identifying patterns, and refining our understanding of how financial predators like Mason operated. Dr. Levinson was particularly interested in my perspective as someone who had lived intimately with such a predator without detecting his true nature. What do you think allowed him to maintain the deception so effectively? He asked. In retrospect, were there signs you believe you missed? It was a question I'd asked myself countless times over the years. There were small inconsistencies, I admitted. Comments that didn't quite align with previous statements, reactions that seemed disproportionate to situations, periodic unexplained absences. But he always had plausible explanations, and they were isolated enough that they didn't form an obvious pattern. The compartmentalization was impressive, Dr. Levinson observed. His ability to maintain distinct personas without cross-contamination speaks to an unusual level of cognitive control. He also strategically disclosed certain vulnerabilities, I added, remembering moments when Mason had shared carefully curated personal struggles. Just enough to seem authentic and create the illusion of intimacy without revealing anything truly significant. Dr. Levinson made rapid notes. Controlled vulnerability as a manipulation tactic. Fascinating. By the end of our meeting, we had outlined several key indicators that might help identify similar predators, behavioral patterns, linguistic markers, and financial red flags that, when combined, could signal potential danger. This work could save lives, Dr. Levinson said. As we concluded, your willingness to revisit these painful experiences for the greater good is remarkable, Ms. Reynolds. I smiled wryly. If there's any meaning to be found in what happened, it's in preventing others from experiencing it. That evening, I received notification that the parole board had approved Vanessa's release with conditions similar to those I'd suggested. The news prompted mixed emotions, a lingering sense of injustice balanced against my genuine belief in the possibility of redemption. The Swiss authorities have requested that you make yourself available for questioning, either in person or via secure video conference. I'll do whatever is necessary, I said firmly. I've spent years helping his victims and working to prevent similar crimes. I won't let this woman smear that work with blatant falsehoods. After arranging the logistics for the upcoming interview with Swiss authorities, I called Dr. Levinson to inform him of this new development. His expertise might prove valuable in understanding who this Claire Donovan was and how she fit into Mason's network. A partner, he mused when I explained the situation. That's uncommon in this type of predator, but not unprecedented. If she's telling the truth about her role, she could provide valuable insights into Reynolds's methods and mindset. If she's telling the truth about anything, I countered, her first statements included outright lies about my involvement, which could be misdirection, an attempt to establish leverage, or simply spite, he observed. I'd be very interested in reviewing her statements once they're available. The Swiss interview was scheduled for 2 days later, a secure video conference that would include representatives from both Swiss and American law enforcement. In the intervening time, I reached out to Eliza, whose cybersecurity expertise had proven invaluable during the original investigation. Claire Donovan, she repeated thoughtfully when I asked if the name meant anything to her. Give me a few hours. If she existed in Mason's digital world, I'll find traces. True to her word, Eliza called back that evening with preliminary findings. She's real, and she definitely knew Mason. I've found encrypted communications between them dating back at least 8 years, before you were even in the picture. What kind of communications? The fragments I've decrypted suggest a business relationship with romantic undertones. They used a sophisticated code system when discussing operations, but the pattern suggests she functioned as something between a partner and a protégé. The revelation sent my mind spinning back through memories of my marriage, searching for any mention of this woman, any unexplained absences that might have involved her. I never heard her name, never saw any indication of her existence. Mason was exceptionally compartmentalized, Eliza reminded me, and this woman appears to have been extremely cautious about digital footprints. I'm only finding traces because I know exactly what to look for based on patterns from the original investigation. Do you think she poses a genuine threat? Or is this just a desperate attempt to save herself by muddying the waters? Eliza considered the question carefully. Potentially both. If she was truly Mason's contingency plan, she's likely dangerous in her own right. And discrediting you would certainly serve her interests, especially if she's hoping to cast doubt on the entire case against Mason. The next morning brought another call from Captain Harlow. "We've received additional information from Interpol. Claire Donovan has been on their radar for several years in connection with identity theft and financial fraud across multiple European countries. She appears to have operated independently from Mason in some instances, while collaborating with him in others." "A division of territory?" I suggested. "Possibly. Or a relationship that evolved over time. What's clear is that she's sophisticated and well-connected. The Swiss authorities found over €3 million in assets connected to her various identities." The interview with Swiss authorities lasted nearly 4 hours, with officials methodically walking through Claire Donovan's allegations and my refutations. I provided detailed timelines, documentation of my actions following the discovery of Mason's crimes, and references to the extensive evidence gathered during the original investigation. "Ms. Donovan claims that you and she met on 3 occasions to coordinate aspects of the operation," stated Inspector Rousseau, a stern-faced woman with impeccable English. "Specifically, she alleges meetings in New York in September 2019, Chicago in February 2020, and Miami in July 2020. I shook my head firmly. "That's demonstrably false. I have documented alibi evidence for all 3 timeframes. In September 2019, I was in Seattle for a professional conference. There are attendance records, hotel receipts, and colleagues who can verify my presence. In February 2020, I was in Boston visiting my sister who had just given birth to her second child. Hospital visitor logs will confirm this. And in July 2020, I was in San Francisco for a quarterly planning meeting with my accounting firm's executive team." The questioning continued, with each of Donovan's claims systematically dismantled by evidence and logical inconsistencies. By the end, even the initially skeptical Swiss officials appeared convinced of my innocence. "Reynolds," Inspector Rousseau concluded, "your detailed responses have been most helpful in clarifying these matters." After the interview ended, Captain Harlow remained on the line. "You did well," she said approvingly. "Very thorough and composed." "I've had years of practice discussing these events," I replied dryly. Though I never expected to defend myself against accusations of being Mason's accomplice. For what it's worth, I don't think these allegations will gain any traction. The evidence of your victimization and subsequent advocacy is too substantial. I hope you're right. The last thing Mason's actual victims need is to have their experiences called into question because of this woman's lies. In the days that followed, I threw myself into work, finalizing preparations for the Washington meetings, reviewing grant applications for my foundation, and continuing collaboration with Dr. Levinson on our research. Keeping busy had always been my method for managing stress, transforming anxiety into productive action. A week after the Swiss interview, Captain Harlow called with an update. "Claire Donovan has changed her approach. She's now offering to provide information about previously unknown victims and financial holdings in exchange for consideration. In her case. Is she still maintaining that I was involved? No, she's dropped those claims entirely. It seems they were indeed just an initial attempt to create leverage or confusion." I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. "Do you think her information is valuable?" "Potentially. She's provided preliminary details about 2 women who match the profile of Mason's victims and disappeared under circumstances similar to the Borer-known cases. If her information leads to the recovery of remains or stolen assets, the prosecutors may consider a plea arrangement." The news brought mixed emotions. Relief that my reputation wouldn't be tarnished by false allegations, but renewed grief for the additional victims who might soon be identified. How many lives had Mason destroyed? How wide was the circle of pain created by his predation? 2 days later, I was in Washington, D.C., meeting with congressional staffers to discuss the proposed Financial Exploitation Prevention Act. The legislation had gained momentum, with several key committee members expressing support after reviewing case studies provided by my foundation. "The personal stories are compelling," noted Jessica Chen, chief legislative aide to Senator Markowitz. particularly the economic impact analysis showing how these crimes affect not just individuals, but entire communities. Financial exploitation rarely happens in isolation, I explained. When someone loses their savings or takes on debt due to fraud, the effects ripple outward, creating strain on social services, reducing consumer spending in local economies, even increasing healthcare costs due to stress-related illness. The banking industry has concerns about implementation costs, she warned. They're lobbying for a scaled-back version of the reporting requirements. We anticipated that, I acknowledged. That's why we commissioned the cost-benefit analysis, demonstrating that the proposed measures would actually save institutions money in the long term by reducing fraud-related losses and litigation. The meeting concluded positively, with Chen promising to arrange a direct conversation with Senator Markowitz before the bill went to committee. As I left the Hart Senate office building, my phone buzzed with a text from Eliza. Found something significant. Call when you can. I ducked into a nearby cafe and called immediately. Remember how we always wondered where the bulk of Mason's money went? Eliza began without preamble. The forensic accountants only traced about 60% of his estimated earnings from various schemes. Of course, the missing millions were a major loose end. I think I found them, or at least a substantial portion. I've been monitoring blockchain activity related to the cryptocurrency addresses we identified during the original investigation. There's been movement recently, transfers that suggest automated protocols being activated. My pulse quickened. Triggered by what? That's the interesting part. The timing correlates precisely with Claire Donovan's arrest. It appears Mason established a dead man's switch of sorts. If she didn't perform certain verification actions periodically, the funds would automatically move according to predetermined instructions. Where did they go? Through a series of anonymizing transfers, but I've traced the end destination. The funds, approximately $12 million worth, were ultimately converted to conventional currency and deposited in accounts connected to a private foundation called New Horizons Initiative. I frowned, trying to place the name. Another lie in a lifetime of deceptions. His mother is alive? Very much so. And based on the foundation's financial disclosures, living quite comfortably in Palm Beach, Florida. The revelation opened yet another chapter in the seemingly endless saga of Mason's crimes. Had his mother been complicit in his schemes? A beneficiary, but not a participant? Or perhaps another victim, manipulated into serving as an unwitting money launderer? I need to tell Captain Harlow, I said, my mind racing with implications. If Margaret Reynolds is knowingly in possession of stolen funds, she could face serious charges. Already compiled the evidence for law enforcement, Eliza assured me. But I thought you should know first, given your personal connection. Personal connection. The phrase struck me as darkly amusing. My personal connection to Mason had been based entirely on fabrications. A carefully constructed false identity designed to engender trust and facilitate exploitation. Now, years after his death, new layers of deception continued to emerge, reminding me how thoroughly I had been deceived. The discovery of Margaret Reynolds set in motion another wave of investigations. Captain Harlow coordinated with Florida authorities to approach the elderly woman who claimed complete ignorance of the source of her son's wealth. According to preliminary reports, she maintained that Mason had established the foundation as a tribute to her lifelong interest in women's education, and that she had no knowledge of his criminal activities. Whether this professed ignorance was genuine or another layer of deception remained to be determined. Forensic accountants were once again poring over financial records, and Margaret Reynolds's electronic communications were being analyzed for any indication of knowledge or complicity. Meanwhile, in Switzerland, Claire Donovan had begun providing detailed information about Mason's operations, revealing a network more extensive than previously understood. According to Captain Harlow, Donovan portrayed herself as a business partner who had been gradually sidelined as Mason's methods became increasingly violent. She claims she drew the line at physical harm, Captain Harlow reported. That she was willing to participate in the financial schemes, but objected when Mason began eliminating victims who threatened exposure. "Do you believe her?" I asked. Skeptically. "Our analysts think it's partially true. The evidence suggests she wasn't directly involved in the killings, but she certainly knew about them and continued the partnership afterward. She's minimizing her culpability, but the information she's providing appears accurate." The collaborative investigation had already led to the recovery of additional remains, 2 women whose disappearances had previously been classified as voluntary missing persons cases. Dental records confirmed their identities as Jennifer Lacey and Mariko Tanaka, both successful professionals who had vanished in 2017 and 2018 respectively. Dr. Levinson had shifted his focus to understanding the dynamics between Mason and Claire Donovan, developing a psychological profile of their partnership that might help identify similar criminal duos in the future. "It's an unusual arrangement," he explained during our weekly call. "Most predators of Reynolds's type are solitary operators who view others as either useful tools or potential victims. A sustained partnership suggests something distinctive about their relationship." "Could it have been romantic?" I asked, still struggling to reconcile this new information with the man I thought I had known. "Elements of that are likely present, but I suspect the primary bond was based on shared pathology. 2 individuals with complementary psychological profiles who recognized and validated each other's darker impulses. In layman's terms, they brought out the worst in each other while maintaining a facade of normalcy to the outside world." The Margaret Reynolds revelation led me to a decision I had been avoiding for years. I needed to visit the house where Mason and I had lived together. After his death, I had instructed my attorney to handle the property's sale without my direct involvement, unable to face the memories contained within those walls. The house had sold quickly to a young family, and I had deliberately avoided driving past it since. But now, with new questions about Mason's background and family, I found myself drawn back to the neighborhood where we had built our seemingly perfect life. Perhaps there were clues I had missed, physical evidence of his true nature that might have been overlooked during the initial investigation. I informed Captain Harlow of my intention, and she arranged for a detective to accompany me. "The current owners have agreed to grant you access," she explained. "They're aware of the general circumstances, though not all the details." On a crisp autumn morning, I found myself standing on the familiar. Detective Rivera, a thoughtful woman with a calm demeanor, stood respectfully at my side. "Take your time," she said gently. "We can leave whenever you need to." The current owners, the Clarks, greeted us at the door with a mix of curiosity and compassion. They had made the house their own, new paint colors, different furniture arrangements, children's toys tastefully integrated into the decor. Yet beneath these changes, the bones of the place remained achingly familiar. "We remodeled the master bathroom and finished the basement," Mrs. Clark explained as she gave us a tour. "But most of the house is structurally the same." I nodded, struggling to reconcile my memories with the transformed space before me. The kitchen where Mason and I had cooked Sunday brunches now featured bright yellow cabinets and children's artwork magnetized to the refrigerator. The living room where we had entertained friends displayed family photos of people I had never met. "Was there something specific you were hoping to find?" Detective Rivera asked as we moved through the house. "I'm not entirely sure," I admitted. "Possibly hiding places, areas that might have been overlooked." Mason had always insisted on handling certain home renovations personally, installing built-in bookshelves in his office, refinishing the attic space, constructing storage solutions in the garage. At the time, I had attributed this to his desire to save money and his enjoyment of woodworking. Now I wondered if he had built hidden compartments, concealed safes, or other secretive elements into the structure of our home. In the office now, repurposed as a children's playroom, I examined the built-in shelving carefully. These were custom-made by my husband, I explained to Mrs. Clark. Would you mind if I checked for any unusual features? She nodded, curious but respectful. Of course. With Detective Rivera assisting, I methodically examined the shelving unit, pressing panels, measuring dimensions, looking for inconsistencies that might indicate hidden spaces. After 20 minutes of careful inspection, we found it. A small discrepancy in the measurements of the lowest shelf that suggested a hollow space behind the seemingly solid back panel. There's something here, Detective Rivera confirmed, running her fingers along the edge of the panel. Some kind of release mechanism, but I can't quite. I remembered Mason's fondness for puzzles and mechanical challenges. Try pressing the corner medallions in sequence, I suggested, recalling how he had designed a jewelry box for me with a similar mechanism. Clockwise from top left. The detective followed my instructions, and with a soft click, the back panel loosened. Behind it lay a shallow compartment containing a waterproof document case. Mrs. Clark watched wide-eyed as Detective Rivera carefully removed the case and placed it on the child-sized table in the center of the room. Would you like some privacy? She asked uncertainly. I appreciated her sensitivity. Yes, if you wouldn't mind. We won't be long. After she left, Detective Rivera donned gloves and carefully opened the case. Inside were several items: a small notebook with handwritten entries, a USB drive, photographs I had never seen before, and several passports with different names but Mason's photo. We'll need to take these into evidence, the detective said, documenting each item with her phone camera before returning them to the case. The tech team and forensic accountants will want to analyze them thoroughly. I nodded, strangely numb. After all this time, Mason was still revealing new secrets, extending his web of deception from beyond the grave. We continued our methodical examination of the house, finding 2 more hidden compartments, one in the master bedroom closet containing emergency cash and gold coins, and another behind a false panel in the basement with several burner phones and prepaid credit cards. Each discovery further confirmed what I already knew. The man I had married had lived a life of calculated duplicity. As we prepared to leave, Mrs. Clark approached me hesitantly. I'm not sure if this is related, she said, but when we first moved in, we received several pieces of mail for someone named Edward Chambers. We marked them "Return to sender, no longer at this address," but they kept coming for a while. Edward Chambers, another name I had never heard, potentially another of Mason's aliases. When did they stop? Detective Rivera asked. About 2 years ago, around the time of that big news story about. She trailed off, glancing at me apologetically. About my husband's death, I completed for her. It's okay. You can say it. Yes. After that, the mail for Mr. Detective Rivera, a thoughtful woman with a calm demeanor, stood respectfully at my side. Take your time, she said gently. We can leave whenever you need to. The current owners, the Clarks, greeted us at the door with a mix of curiosity and compassion. They had made the house their own: new paint colors, different furniture arrangements, children's toys tastefully integrated into the decor. Yet beneath these changes, the bones of the place remained achingly familiar. We remodeled the master bathroom and finished the basement, Mrs. Clark explained as she gave us a tour. But most of the house is structurally the same. I nodded, struggling to reconcile my memories with the transformed space before me. The kitchen where Mason and I had cooked Sunday brunches now featured bright yellow cabinets and children's artwork magnetized to the refrigerator. The living room where we had entertained friends displayed family photos of people I had never met. Was there something specific you were hoping to find? Detective Rivera asked as we moved through the house. I'm not entirely sure, I admitted. Possibly hiding places, areas that might have been overlooked. Mason had always insisted on handling certain home renovations personally, installing built-in bookshelves in his office, refinishing the attic space, constructing storage solutions in the garage. At the time, I had attributed this to his desire to save money and his enjoyment of woodworking. Now, I wondered if he had built hidden compartments, concealed safes, or other secretive elements into the structure of our home. In the office, now, repurposed as a children's playroom, I examined the built-in shelving carefully. "These were custom-made by my husband," I explained to Mrs. Clark. "Would you mind if I checked for any unusual features?" She nodded, curious but respectful. "Of course." With Detective Rivera assisting, I methodically examined the shelving unit, pressing panels, measuring dimensions, looking for inconsistencies that might indicate hidden spaces. After 20 minutes of careful inspection, we found it, a small discrepancy in the measurements of the lowest shelf that suggested a hollow space behind the seemingly solid back panel. "There's something here," Detective Rivera confirmed, running her fingers along the edge of the panel. "Some kind of release mechanism, but I can't quite—" I remembered Mason's fondness for puzzles and mechanical challenges. "Try pressing the corner medallions in sequence," I suggested, recalling how he had designed a jewelry box for me with a similar mechanism. "Clockwise from top left." The detective followed my instructions, and with a soft click, the back panel loosened. Behind it lay a shallow compartment containing a waterproof document case. Mrs. Clark watched wide-eyed as Detective Rivera carefully removed the case and placed it on the child-sized table in the center of the room. Would you like some privacy?" she asked uncertainly. I appreciated her sensitivity. "Yes, if you wouldn't mind. We won't be long." After she left, Detective Rivera donned gloves and carefully opened the case. Inside were several items: a small notebook with handwritten entries, a USB drive, photographs I had never seen before, and several passports with different names but Mason's photo. "We'll need to take these into evidence," the detective said, documenting each item with her phone camera before returning them to the case. "The tech team and forensic accountants will want to analyze them thoroughly." I nodded, strangely numb. After all this time, Mason was still revealing new secrets, extending his web of deception from beyond the grave. We continued our methodical examination of the house, finding 2 more hidden compartments. One in the master bedroom closet containing emergency cash and gold coins, and another behind a false panel in the basement with several burner phones and prepaid credit cards. Each discovery further confirmed what I already knew. The man I had married had lived a life of calculated duplicity. As we prepared to leave, Mrs. Clark approached me hesitantly. "I'm not sure if this is related," she said. "But when we first moved in, we received several pieces of mail for someone named Edward Chambers. We marked them, 'Return to sender, no longer at this address,' but they kept coming for a while." Edward Chambers, another name I had never heard, potentially another of Mason's aliases. "When did they stop?" Detective Rivera asked. "About 2 years ago. Around the time of that big news story about—" She trailed off, glancing at me apologetically. "About my husband's death," I completed for her. "It's okay, you can say it." "Yes." After that, the mail for Mr. Chambers stopped completely. Detective Rivera made notes of this information, promising to investigate the Edward Chambers identity. As we left the house, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: sadness for the life I had believed in, disgust at Mason's elaborate deceptions, and a strange sense of closure from confronting the physical space we had shared. "Are you all right?" Detective Rivera asked as we walked to her car. "Yes," I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. It was difficult but necessary, like lancing an old wound. Back at the police station, the items from the hidden compartments were logged into evidence and the initial analysis began. The notebook contained coded entries that would require cryptographic expertise to decipher. The USB drive was encrypted, with sophisticated security that would take time to bypass. The photographs showed Mason with various unknown individuals in locations across the globe, potential accomplices or victims we had not yet identified. I provided what contextual information I could, recognizing a few of the locations from trips we had taken, identifying the approximate timeframes based on Mason's appearance. It was strange to see these images of familiar places with unfamiliar people, further evidence of the parallel life he had conducted alongside our marriage. "We'll keep you updated on any significant findings," Captain Harlow assured me as I prepared to leave. "And thank you for initiating this search. These items may provide valuable evidence in the ongoing investigations." That evening, I called Dr. Levinson to inform him of the discoveries. "This confirms my assessment of Reynolds as an exceptionally compartmentalized individual," he noted. "The psychological discipline required to maintain such elaborate separate identities and physical evidence caches is remarkable." "Not remarkable," I corrected, a flash of anger cutting through my analytical detachment. "Pathological. Let's not admire his methodology while discussing the harm he caused." "You're absolutely right," Dr. Levinson acknowledged immediately. "I apologize for the clinical framing. The human cost of his actions should remain central to our discussion." We spoke for another hour about the implications of the findings, particularly how they might inform the psychological profile we were developing of financial predators. Before ending the call, he asked a question that caught me off guard. "Have you considered the possibility that Reynolds might have had accomplices beyond Claire Donovan? Perhaps others who haven't yet been identified?" The question triggered a cascade of uncomfortable possibilities. "Yes," I admitted. "Especially after finding the photographs today. There were at least a dozen different people pictured with him in contexts that suggested familiarity." "It might be worth preparing yourself for further revelations," he advised, gently. "Cases like this often continue to unfold for years." His words proved prescient sooner than either of us anticipated. 3 days later, Captain Harlow called with news from the technical team analyzing the encrypted USB drive. "They've managed to access the contents," she reported. "It contains detailed records of an operation much larger than we initially understood. Multiple interconnected schemes across different countries, with various participants handling specific aspects." "How many people are we talking about?" "At least 8 active accomplices, based on the documents, each with defined roles and territories. Mason appears to have been the architect and central coordinator, but the day-to-day operations were distributed among specialized team members." The revelation was staggering. Not a lone predator, not even a duo, but an organized criminal network, dedicated to financial exploitation and, when necessary, elimination of threats. The scale suggested that Mason's crimes might have claimed far more victims than we had identified so far. "There's something else," Captain Harlow continued, her voice taking on a cautious tone. "One of the documents references a contingency plan specifically related to you." My blood ran cold. "What kind of contingency plan?" "It's not entirely clear yet. The section is heavily coded and references other documents we don't have access to. But it suggests that Reynolds had established protocols to be activated if you began investigating his activities." Protocols that might still be active?" I asked, the implications hitting me like a physical blow. "That's what we're trying to determine. Until we know more, we're increasing surveillance on your residence and regular locations. I'd advise limiting your public appearances and varying your routines as much as possible." But this was different. Evidence of a specific plan, potentially still in effect, directed explicitly at me. I called Eliza, whose cybersecurity expertise now seemed more essential than ever. "I need a complete digital security audit," I explained, after sharing Captain Harlow's information. "Everything. My home network, devices, online accounts, the Foundation's systems. If there's anyone watching me through digital means, I need to know." "I'll be on the next flight," she promised. Don't connect any new devices or access sensitive accounts until I get there. The next 48 hours were a tense exercise in heightened vigilance. I followed Captain Harlow's advice, canceling scheduled appearances and working remotely. A plainclothes officer was stationed near my home, and I received regular check-in calls from the department. When Eliza arrived, she brought an arsenal of specialized equipment to sweep for surveillance devices and analyze digital vulnerabilities. Starting with my home, she conducted a methodical examination of every room, checking for hidden cameras, microphones, or other monitoring devices. "Your security system has been tampered with," she announced after several hours of work. "It's subtle. I almost missed it. There's a secondary transmitter piggybacking on the legitimate one, sending your alarm status and entry-exit patterns to an external server. How long has it been there?" She examined the components more closely. Based on the installation marks and component age, I'd estimate at least 2 years, possibly installed during routine maintenance. The thought that someone had been monitoring my home security for years sent a wave of nausea through me. "Can you disable it without alerting whoever is receiving the data?" "Better than that," she said with grim satisfaction. "I can feed it false information while we trace it back to the recipient. Make them think you're maintaining normal patterns while we figure out who's watching." Next, Eliza examined my digital devices and accounts, identifying several concerning vulnerabilities. My primary email account showed evidence of access from unauthorized locations, disguised to avoid triggering security alerts. The Foundation's database had been subjected to multiple sophisticated intrusion attempts, some partially successful. Most disturbing of all, the GPS tracking in my car had been compromised, allowing my movements to be monitored remotely. This explained how someone might have been able to track my routines without physical surveillance. "We need to set up completely new systems," Eliza concluded after completing her assessment. "Clean devices, fresh accounts, different security protocols. But we'll keep the compromised ones active temporarily, feed them misleading information, while we investigate who's accessing them." Captain Harlow arranged for technical support from the FBI's Cybercrime Division, who worked with Eliza to establish digital counterintelligence measures. Meanwhile, the analysis of Mason's notebook and USB drive continued, gradually revealing more details about his operation and the contingency plans he had established. "The Edward Chambers identity is significant," reported Agent Takeda, the FBI analyst assigned to the case. "He appears to have been Reynolds' most comprehensive alternate persona, complete tax history, credit records, professional credentials as a financial consultant. Far more thoroughly established than his other aliases." "And the connection to the contingency plan regarding me?" I asked. "That's where it gets interesting," Agent Takeda said, sliding a document across the table. "According to these decrypted notes, Edward Chambers was designed to be activated if Reynolds needed to reset his relationship with you." I stared at the document, trying to process the implications. "Reset how?" "The plan was multi-layered," Agent Takeda explained carefully. "If you discovered any aspect of his criminal activities, he would stage his own death as Mason Reynolds, allow time for you to begin recovery, then re-enter your life as Edward Chambers, a sympathetic, supportive figure who would gradually establish himself as a potential romantic interest." The calculated cruelty of the scheme left me momentarily speechless. Mason had planned not just to deceive me once, but to potentially do so twice, exploiting the vulnerability and trauma that his own actions would have created. I struggled to find words adequate to the horror of it. "Sociopathic?" Dr. Levinson supplied, having joined the briefing at my request. "A level of emotional manipulation that demonstrates complete absence of empathy or conscience. The truly concerning aspect," Agent Takeda continued, "is that we haven't been able to definitively determine if someone else could implement this plan in Reynolds' absence." The thought sent a chill through me that no amount of security measures could entirely dispel. For the next 2 weeks, I lived in a state of controlled paranoia, following stringent security protocols while maintaining a facade of normal activity through the compromised systems Eliza had identified. The counterintelligence operation yielded valuable data, tracing unauthorized access to my accounts back to servers in several countries. "We've identified one of the primary monitors," Captain Harlow reported during our daily update call. "A man named Victor Mercer, based in Toronto. He matches one of the individuals from the photographs recovered from your former home." "What do we know about him?" "Former cybersecurity specialist, left the legitimate sector about 10 years ago. Since then, he's been connected to various identity theft and financial fraud operations, though never successfully prosecuted. Based on the communications we've intercepted, he appears to be actively tracking your activities and reporting to someone else." "The designated successor?" "Possibly. We're coordinating with Canadian authorities to place him under surveillance, hoping he'll lead us to his superior." Meanwhile, Eliza had made progress in identifying the source of the tampering with my home security system. The component was manufactured by a specialty electronics firm with only 3 authorized installers. "In this region," she explained. "I've traced the specific serial number to a batch purchased by C-Safe Security Services. I recognized the name immediately. They handled the upgrade to my system after Mason's crimes were first discovered. Captain Harlow recommended them." Eliza nodded grimly. "Which suggests someone at C-Safe is connected to the network. A perfect position to compromise security systems for high-value targets." This information was immediately shared with law enforcement, who began investigating C-Safe's personnel and client records. Within days, they had identified a technician named Paul Deering, who had installed systems for several wealthy clients who later reported identity theft or financial fraud. "Deering is definitely connected," Captain Harlow confirmed. "When we brought him in for questioning, he lawyered up immediately and hasn't said a word. But his bank records show regular payments from shell companies linked to Victor Mercer." The web was gradually expanding, revealing an operation far more sophisticated and extensive than initially suspected. What had begun as an investigation into one man's crimes had evolved into the dismantling of an international criminal network specializing in targeted financial predation. Throughout this process, I continued my work with the Foundation, though with modified methods to accommodate security concerns. The proposed legislation was moving forward in committee, with a hearing scheduled for the following month. Dr. Levinson and I refined our research based on the new information, developing a more comprehensive understanding of how organized groups could systematically perpetrate financial exploitation. 6 weeks into the investigation, a significant breakthrough occurred. Victor Mercer, under intensive surveillance by Canadian authorities, traveled to Zurich for what appeared to be a prearranged meeting. Swiss police, coordinating with Interpol, observed him entering a private dining room at an exclusive restaurant. "They've identified the other party," Captain Harlow reported, her voice tense with excitement. "Catherine Reynolds, Mason's sister." "Sister?" I repeated incredulously. "Mason told me he was an only child. I never heard any mention of a sister." According to records we've obtained, Catherine Reynolds is 3 years younger than Mason. They were separated as children after their parents' divorce. Mason stayed with their father, Catherine with their mother. They reconnected as adults. Another family member emerging from the shadows, another layer of deception in the life I thought I had understood. How many Reynolds family members were involved in this operation? How deep did the conspiracy extend? Swiss authorities arrested both Mercer and Catherine Reynolds following their meeting, securing valuable evidence including digital devices and handwritten notes. Catherine's initial interrogation revealed a startling new dimension to the case. "She claims that Mason isn't actually dead," Captain Harlow informed me, her voice carefully neutral. According to her statement, the body in Switzerland was a deliberate misdirection. Someone altered to look like Mason, who died by suicide as part of a prearranged plan. "That's impossible," I objected immediately. "There was dental record, confirmation, DNA testing." "We're investigating her claims thoroughly," Captain Harlow assured me, reviewing all the forensic evidence from the original identification. So far, everything indicates that the body was indeed Mason Reynolds. Levinson suggested that this psychological uncertainty might be part of a deliberate strategy. Creating doubt about Reynolds' death serves multiple purposes, he explained during our next consultation. It maintains his mythic status within the organization, prevents members from feeling free to defect, and most perniciously, keeps you in a state of hypervigilance and fear. It's working, I admitted. Even knowing it's a manipulation tactic doesn't entirely prevent it from affecting me. That's because it targets fundamental survival instincts, he said sympathetically. The possibility of threat from someone who intimately knows your vulnerabilities triggers profound psychological defense mechanisms. To address these concerns definitively, Captain Harlow arranged for me to review the complete forensic file from Mason's death investigation, including photographs I had previously declined to view. The evidence was comprehensive and conclusive. The body in Switzerland was unquestionably Mason Reynolds. Catherine's claim is false, confirmed the forensic pathologist who had conducted the original examination. The identification is scientifically certain based on multiple factors: dental records, DNA, distinctive surgical screws in the left ankle from a sports injury, even the appendectomy scar you mentioned in your initial statements. This confirmation brought a measure of relief, though the psychological impact of Catherine's deliberate manipulation lingered. I found myself wondering what other strategies she and her associates might employ to maintain their psychological advantage. I didn't have to wait long to find out. 3 days later, I received a package at my foundation office, a small box with no return address, postmarked from Seattle. Security protocols meant that all mail was screened before reaching me, and this package had been flagged for inspection. The bomb squad determined that it contained no explosives or hazardous materials, just a single item. A silver bracelet I recognized immediately. Mason had given it to me on our first anniversary, and it had been in our house at the time of his crimes. I had assumed it was still there when the property was sold. Attached was a handwritten note. Some things should be returned to their rightful owner. More will follow. E.C. Edward Chambers. The alternate identity Mason had created for his reset plan. The implication was clear. Someone had access to personal items from my former life with Mason and was using them to suggest that his contingency plan was being activated. Whether this was Catherine directing operations from detention in Switzerland, another network member taking initiative, or something else entirely remained to be determined. The bracelet and note were immediately submitted for forensic analysis. The handwriting didn't match Mason's known samples, suggesting someone else was implementing his plan. The bracelet itself yielded no useful evidence. No fingerprints, no DNA, no traces that might identify who had handled it. "We're increasing security again," Captain Harlow informed me after reviewing the incident, "and accelerating efforts to identify all members of the network. This type of psychological intimidation suggests they're feeling pressure from our investigation." I nodded, processing this latest development with a strange sense of detachment. After months of revelations and threats, I had developed a certain resilience to new shocks. "They want me frightened," I observed. "Reactive rather than proactive." "Exactly," she agreed, "which is why continuing your work while we handle the security is the best response. Don't let them dictate your choices." It was sound advice, and I resolved to follow it. The Foundation's work was too important to suspend because of intimidation tactics. The proposed legislation needed a strong advocate as it moved through committee. The research with Dr. Levinson could potentially help countless future victims. Yet even as I maintained my professional commitments, the personal toll of living under constant threat was significant. Sleep became elusive, replaced by hyper-alert vigilance that left me exhausted but unable to relax. I found myself analyzing everyday interactions for hidden meanings or possible connections to Mason's network. The psychological weight of suspicion colored even the most innocent encounters. During this difficult period, I found unexpected support from Vanessa Miller, now released on parole and working at a women's shelter in Portland. We had established a cautious professional relationship after her release, with Vanessa occasionally consulting on the Foundation's programs for survivors of financial abuse. "I recognized the tactics immediately when you described them," she said during one of our video conferences. "Mason used similar methods with me, little reminders that he had access to my personal space, cryptic messages that could be interpreted multiple ways. I became paranoid, isolated myself, which only made me more dependent on him. It was only later, after everything fell apart, that I realized how effectively he had manipulated my perception of reality." Her insights proved valuable as I worked with my security team to develop countermeasures against the psychological warfare being waged. Rather than reacting with fear to each new message or apparent surveillance, I began documenting patterns, identifying weaknesses in their approach, and strategically releasing misleading information through channels we knew were compromised. "You're turning their tactics against them," Dr. Levinson observed approvingly during our weekly consultation. "Creating uncertainty about what you know and what actions you're taking." This proactive approach yielded results faster than anyone anticipated. 2 weeks after the bracelet incident, Victor Mercer offered to cooperate with authorities in exchange for consideration in his case. His information led to the identification of 3 more network members, including a banker who had helped launder proceeds from the schemes and a real estate agent who had identified potential victims. Most significantly, Mercer confirmed that Catherine Reynolds had assumed leadership of the operation following Mason's death, implementing modified versions of his contingency plans while establishing her own methodology.